The essence of God may not be raw power. And isn't that sometimes how we, I think, tend to default towards our ideas of God? That when we think of what we call God, we think of power, we think of might, we think of strength, we think of omnipotence, the great, almighty, and all-powerful God. But what if what Elijah is revealing to us is that the essence of God is not the raw power of the fire that comes down from heaven? What if the essence of God is not the windstorm that sweeps through and eradicates everything in its path? What if the essence of God is not the earthquake that splits the rocks and the mountains? What if the essence of God is that minute silence, that sheer stillness, that gentleness that characterizes the God who wants to meet us with that still, small voice that is so intimate and delicate and personal? I think that speaks to the nearness of God that we also see reflected in the words of Jesus, who says that God does not break a bent reed or bruise a bent reed or snuff out a smoldering wick, that the essence of God's character is gentleness, that picking up on the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, that God is here for those who are poor and those who are meek. That like Christ and Christ's calling to his followers, God is here for those who extend themselves to God from the margins, that God is meeting those who have been pushed out and ostracized and excluded, that God is calling those folks into his kingdom who are most fragile, most weak, most beaten down, and most downtrodden. What if that really is the essence of the character of God? And this, I think, reveals to us a second implication of this passage in 1 Kings chapter 19, and that is, if the essence of God is the minute silence or the still small voice that comes to us in that quiet place, then what are the implications of that for how we hear God as a church, for how we hear God and discern God in our times, in the things that are happening in our world? And I think the implication is this, that we oftentimes default to thinking that God's voice, that God's will, that God's purposes are made known to us by the loudest voices, by the most plentiful voices, by the majority who speaks out and says who God is and what is right and good and true. But if God's voice is the still, small voice, if it's the quiet voice that can be drowned out by the noise, then I think it's also true that sometimes God's will, God's purposes, God's desires are not expressed by the majority voices, not expressed by the loudest voices, but oftentimes are expressed by the quietest voices, by the minority voices among us. And that is exactly what the prophets are in the Old Testament. They are the minority report. When the majority of the priests and the kings are going one way, the prophets, like Elijah, come along and they say, no, this is not God's way. This is not what God requires of you. This is not God's heart for you and your community. And if that's true, then Jesus, in saying that we encounter him through the least of these, would begin to make a lot more sense. Jesus says it's not just the minority voices or the quiet voices that often speak for God. Jesus says that it's literally those who are the least, the hungry, the poor, the naked, the imprisoned, where we don't just hear God, but Jesus says we encounter God in the flesh. If you remember in Matthew 25, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus says that he comes to us as the poor, the hungry, the naked, and the imprisoned. And that means then, as a church, that if we want to have genuine encounters with God, that this isn't just about us cultivating a kind of personal meditative practice where we can quiet our hearts and experience God in the minute silence of those moments, although that is true. It also means that as a corporate body, as a church, it's our job to become disciplined enough to center those minority voices in our midst so we don't miss what God is trying to tell us. All of that, I know, can be really hard and really difficult and really vulnerable because we all want our way. And I think this is what Simone Weil is speaking to with her quote. I think that our main task is to let go of our own ego desires and allow God to speak to us in the stillness and in the quietness of our encounters with Him. Today, my prayer is that we would learn to do that as a church, not just you individually, but that together as a church, we would learn to quiet ourselves, that we would learn to experience God in the still, small voice that comes to us in those moments of sheer silence, of minute stillness, and that we would be able to do that as a corporate body, that we would learn to center those voices who may, in their own stillness, their own meekness, be speaking a word of God to us.